In this video, I wanted to take a look at how you can interact with on-prem SQL databases using Nintex workflow for Office 365. Similar to Nintex for SharePoint on-prem, Nintex workflow for Office 365 also has an execute SQL action. This action can be configured within the workflow designer, similar to what we have on-prem. However, there are some slight nuances with this action that we'll dive into, and then we're going to talk about a potential alternative that can help you get around some of those shortcomings. Out of the box, in the execute SQL action, the first thing to note is that databases that you're trying to interact with must be internet accessible. You're then going to provide a connection string, which will have the server and the database that you're trying to connect to, and then a user ID and password. And this is the first potential issue that some people have with the execute SQL action, is that these credentials are sent in plain text. While in the designer, you can use something like a reference to get around showing that in the designer. When it's passed over the network, they are still passed as plain text strings. The next step of the configuration is actually providing the query that you're going to use. In this case, we're just doing a select from the workflow instance table in our workflow database. You're then going to specify the column that you want to retrieve, and you'll load the output into a collection variable, in this case, instance IDs. At this point, you've now successfully configured the execute SQL action. However, there are a couple other caveats that are worth noting. The first is, if you're connecting to an on-prem database, on that server, you do need to whitelist the Azure IP range, and that can be a considerable lift on the IT department to be able to update those IPs. Additionally, when connecting to an on-prem database, you do have to connect over port 1433. Given these requirements to use the execute SQL action in O365, some admins may ask for another way or more secure way to be able to interact with their on-prem databases. We'll go ahead and run this workflow just to see what the output looks like, and then we'll take a look at a potential alternative that can be a more secure way of interacting with SQL. So here on my list, I'll go ahead and run the SQL. And what we've done in this workflow is I'm logging the instance IDs, so the variable that the output was housed to, and also sending an email with the instance IDs, as they will be more than 150 characters, and therefore the log to history won't capture everything. Within our workflow history, we can see that the workflow has started logging the instance IDs from SQL to our history list. We'll go ahead and check our email, and we can see that it returned all the instance IDs in a collection from our table. We refresh. This workflow is now completed. So as you can see, you can pull data from an on-prem environment. What we're going to do now is look at a different way to accomplish this same outcome that's slightly more secure than using the out-of-the-box execute SQL action. In this workflow, what we're going to do is we're actually going to leverage Nintex Workflow Cloud and its secure credential manager to execute the SQL query for us. The way that we're going to do this is using the start workflow in Nintex Workflow Cloud action. This is going to actually make a call to a component workflow in Nintex Workflow Cloud. We're going to pass it the current item ID and then the query that we want it to execute. This will then wait for a change, the NWC response, this is a field that we created, to go to ready. It will log the query output that we're going to get back from the workflow in NWC, and then set the workflow status to complete. So let's go ahead and jump over to NWC and take a look at what that workflow looks like. Here in NWC, I have a component workflow that has our two start variables, so the item ID and the query. Next, we have the execute a query action, and while I don't have a connection yet, we're going to take a look at that in a moment. The query will actually be that query that we got from O365. The column to retrieve will still be our workflow instance ID, and then we're going to store the output in this query output variable. What we'll do then is we will log the query output to the history list, And then we're going to update the data back to Office 365. And how I'm doing this is I have my connection to O365 in my list, the item ID we got from that start parameter. Query output is a column that I have on the list, and so it's going to get that query output value. And then that NWC response column I'm going to set to ready, because again, that's what our wait for field change in current item is waiting for. What this means is that it will wait until the NWC workflow is complete and then progress through the rest of the workflow here in Office 365. Before we run this workflow, we do still need to configure that connection in NWC to our SQL server. So let's take a look at that. Here in our execute a query, we'll go into our connection, say new connection, and this is going to be using the Nintex Secure Credential Manager to connect into that SQL server. While you still will need to whitelist a couple IP addresses, they're set IP addresses and not the entire Azure range like you would have to do for the execute SQL action in O365. For my connection name, we'll call this on-prem SQL. For our database host, I'm going to pass the IP address of this server. The database name is going to be our Nintex Workflow DB. And then I'm going to pass a username and password. Unlike the native O365 execute SQL action, this is going to take these credentials and store them securely so that they are not passed in plain text. Once all of this is set, we'll connect, save and publish the workflow, and then run it. Back here in O365, we'll go ahead and run this workflow. We'll jump back over to Nintex Workflow Cloud to see if that workflow has run. And we can see that the execute SQL testing has completed. So we'll jump back to O365. In our workflow history, we can see that that's been queued for execution. We know that it's run. It started logging those instance IDs back to the table. And we can see that it's now complete. Remember, in this workflow, I didn't have the email that had all of the IDs, but we can tell that it's actually gone through and processed all of those by the workflow completing without a failure. So again, a slightly different way to look at how to connect to SQL using Nintex Workflow Cloud in conjunction with Office 365. I hope this video has been helpful, and if there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to help. Thank you.